Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Development Discourse, where we ideate for Africa's development. My name is Patrick Okibo. I'm the founding partner at Next Year. Next Year is a multi-competency advisory firm focused on helping address Africa's complex development challenges. And today we confront one of the most consequential questions facing Africa. How have some African countries achieved sustainable economic transformation? Not a lot of us. And what would it take to change that so that more countries in Africa become prosperous? For decades, the standard explanations have been quite familiar to us: corruption, poor governance, weak institutions, ethnic divisions, colonialism, conflict, etc. Our guest today does not dismiss these factors, but he asks a much deeper question. Have we mistaken some of the symptoms for the underlying causes? And whether our development prescriptions have therefore begun in the wrong place. Joe Studwell is a journalist, researcher, and one of the most provocative contemporary writers on political economy and development. His earlier book, How Asia Works, examines why Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and China transformed their economies while some foreign countries fell behind. It has become the seminal text for understanding Asia's development. His much anticipated and well received new book, How Africa Works, Success and Failure on, is one of the best and most recent and most intelligent description of what is happening in Africa today. It asks whether the economic lessons associated with successful Asian development also applies to Africa, and how Africa's distinct demographic, ecological, and political history changes the route to implementation. Joe Studwell is a senior visiting fellow at the Overseas Development Institute, ODI. He holds a doctorate from the University of Cambridge and is also the author of Asian Godfathers and the China Dream. Joe, welcome to Development Discourse.
Thank you very much for having me.
Fantastic. Now, let me assume that some of our guests or people who are going to listen to this afterwards may not have read How Asia Works or How Africa Works. So let's begin with, the core thesis of the book. In your clearest possible terms, how do poor countries become rich?
Well, the model that is described in How Asia Works for the most successful Asian countries has three parts to it. The first focuses on smallholder farmers and bringing very broadly dispersed, small but very broadly dispersed income gains to the bulk of the population, because in poor countries, by definition, the majority of people always work in agriculture.
Mhm.
So what happens in agriculture is very important in the judgment of how Asia works. And then it talks about manufacturing as the part of the economy which most naturally and most readily takes people out of the rural economy into the modern urban economy, which finds employment for people who don't necessarily have very high levels of education, but can do vocational can use vocational skills and develop skills while working in a manner that is affordable to a poor country. And the third component of this is that, as I describe it, all of the most successful developing countries historically have ignored the advice that in the modern era the IMF or the World Bank would give, and they have maintained capital controls, and they have directed bank credit to support those parts of the economy that are most important to development policy, namely smallholder agriculture and particularly manufacturing. So that's been the pattern. It's what we most obviously associate with the very successful countries in East Asia, but I would argue that it also typified the European catch-up states, states like Germany and then France and Italy later. They all pursued this this recipe. And actually, if you go back originally, I would argue that it is what the United States did,
Hmm.
where smallholder farming, although smallholders in America had more land because America just has a lot of land. The United States just has a lot of land available, so people were getting 20 acres usually. But the emphasis on manufacturing and the control of the financial system, all of the components, in my view, were the same. So that's really been the consistent pattern historically. And for me, the surprise is that people have difficulty in sort of recognizing that historical pattern and seeing it.
And then you looked at Africa, you saw that same pattern. Is there a sequence, that must be followed, the way you laid it out in the book, and why is that sequence important?
I mean, when you're a poor country and you get a leadership that wants to develop that country's economy, you necessarily start with agriculture because, as I say, that's what most of your people are doing. And
Hmm.
you focus on smallholder agriculture and increasing output, increasing the surplus, and you get this very broad-based consumption, which translates very nicely into demand for goods and services that you can produce locally rather than goods and services that you need to import. So the sequence goes from agriculture to manufacturing, and then the financial arrangements are wrapped around that. That's what it is as a rule of thumb. But of course, you don't you don't move from focusing on agriculture to manufacturing and then forget about agriculture. The things go on simultaneously. When I looked at African countries that have made good progress, and you're right, it's a very small number, but when you look at Mauritius, Botswana, Ethiopia, Rwanda, you find the same pattern. Find the same pattern of the focus on agriculture, followed by efforts in manufacturing and the same financial arrangements. The exception is Botswana, where there is a focus on agriculture because the Swana rulers always took agriculture seriously, but it was aristocracy dominated large scale cattle herding there, and they didn't really do anything with manufacturing, which has left them with a very unequal society. But they didn't need to in Botswana, right? Because they've got three giant diamond mines and a low population. So it's a very as a case study, it's a very unusual case study. But they did nonetheless retain capital controls and control the banking system in the same way. But Mauritius and Ethiopia and Rwanda are much more like the sort of the Asian sequence. And I think it was striking that there's no difference, there's no special African source in policy
Hmm.
terms. But what there is a very different African context. And fundamentally, my argument in how Africa works is that that context is defined by low population density, or at least it has been.
Hmm.
So you look at Africa in 1960, when actually, some development economists were being quite enthusiastic about African prospects because of the availability of minerals on the continent. But Africa in 1960 had the population density of Europe in 1500.
Hmm.
And to my mind, there was no way that Africa was going to uh, accumulate and develop at any sort of even at the pace of population increase. I,
Hmm.
with the benefit of hindsight, I think Africa was in a very bad place in 1960 developmentally. But since then, what we've seen is population density on average in Africa increasing to the level that it was in Asia in 1960. So you've got the people that you need to have markets, and
Hmm.
particularly dense urban markets. You've got the people that you need to make infrastructure affordable because you're essentially paying for infrastructure on a per capita basis across your population. And you've got a much better division of labor in African urban centers now. In other words, you've got people with a broad range of skills living close together, and you get the kind of creativity that comes out of that. So, and plus, Africa, as I say in the book, or as I argue in the book, Africa actually did very well after 1960 in terms of building education systems because it was a continent where population had been so sparse that colonial governments didn't operate schools. All there were
Mhm.
small numbers of missionary schools, as you know. And so independent governments taking over in the 60s had to build education systems from scratch. And many African countries did remarkably well at this. You take a country like Tanzania, which, when at independence had 15% literacy, and when Nyerere stepped down in the mid 80s, had 80% literacy. I mean, it's a huge achievement. So today, when we look at Africa, what we see is countries that have got the density of population that is necessary for economic accumulation, which has been necessary everywhere in the world to
Mhm.
accelerated accumulation, and we've got a population with a reasonable education standard. I mean, lots of Africans will complain that the quality of the education systems isn't what it should be. Sure, but just stand back and see the forest instead of looking at the trees here, right? I mean,
Mhm.
what you've
Mhm.
got is people who can read, write, and add up, and you didn't have
Mhm.
that in 1960 when literacy in Africa was 16% and 5% in the female population. So there's been a transformation. So what I argue in how Africa works is that the context for development is now far better.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, but some of the other problems that you alluded to at the beginning are very obviously still there. And the one that probably stands out more than any other is the ethnic fragmentation and diversity
Mhm. Mhm.
of the continent, which, takes a long time for people to get over those kind of visceral um, ethnic responses to whatever goes on.
Mhm.
But I do think that things are better than they were if we go back sort of 30 years into the 1990s. If we look at the places in Africa that have the big problems today in terms of unrest, largely concentrated in Sahel areas, which is a very particular problem. Some of the historically most sparsely populated areas, which have had big population increases and have the least educated populations in the continent,
Mhm.
right? So it's kind of
Mhm.
ripe for
Mhm.
trouble and very difficult to police.
Mhm.
Um,
And you shared a lot of that in the book,
yeah.
with brilliant examples and data. But a question that kind of, stayed with me as I read the book was, are you saying that no country can achieve broad-based prosperity without passing through this sequence? And here I'm thinking, um, could digital services or artificial intelligence, not provide a genuinely different route, versus going through, or maybe even services, must we go through agriculture, especially given that we may have the land, the population, but other parts of the world are producing these things at, lower cost per hectare, and so on and so forth. Do you see a different route, or must we follow this sequence?
I don't see a fundamentally different route. What I see is the same route, but with some changes that have been
Okay.
occurring and that we should recognize. So, smallholder agriculture is important because it's what the majority of your population do, right? It's not a
Mm-hmm.
choice as to whether to do it or not, right? It's what the majority of the choice is whether you're going to support these people or you're not going to support them. Now, if you
Mm-hmm.
support them, as they do, for instance, in Ethiopia, you get this very broad-based income growth, which translates into a consumption profile that is perfect for a developing country because these people want basic consumer goods and construction goods that will be made and now are being made in
Mm-hmm.
Ethiopia, right? If you
Mm-hmm.
ignore these people, you're not going to get that.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, with manufacturing, as I said, manufacturing is um, a part of the economy where people with quite low skill levels coming out of the countryside can go into factories and can learn on the job. They don't have to go into education to get a higher skill level in order to be able to get the job. That is often the case with services. And it's just not affordable for
Mm-hmm.
poor people from the countryside. So if you don't have a manufacturing strategy, you're not going to generate opportunities for these people. You're not going to
Mhm.
use that part of the population. Now,
Mhm.
to go to what you were saying about the digital economy, about services. So we've seen a significant change over the last 30 years. Okay, so 30 years ago, services trade in the world was only 20% of global trade, and now it's
Mhm.
about 28%. So it's gone up 8 percentage points in 30 years. It's been a significant change. This is all of the back office processing activity, software, legal services, all of this kind of stuff,
Mhm.
which developing countries can do and which African countries will do. Not least for Europe, I think, because the time zone
Yep. Advantage. Mhm.
alignment is a big
Mhm.
advantage.
Mhm.
So all of this stuff will get done, but these are jobs for much more, for want of a better term, middle class people, people with a higher level of education. I don't begrudge them getting these better paid jobs, but if you only look to that part of the economy, you are not going to get the broad-based transformation, which gives you a more equal society, a more happy society, and a society which moves economically at a faster pace. And the case that is always held up with respect to this is India, of course,
Mhm.
because
Mhm.
India has not really had an aggressive manufacturing strategy. So it's the share of Indians who work in manufacturing is just, about half of what it is in China, for instance. So it's a 2 for 1 difference. So yeah, so they have emphasized the development of the digital economy and services around the digital economy. Well, let's look back. What has this translated into? If we just look in raw growth terms, since 1991, India has grown an average 4.2% a year. All right,
Mhm.
it's not bad. It's not bad. It's kind of where Africa's getting to now. All right, so you could feel happy about this and say, well, we'll take 4.2%. But you compare that with what China did for 30 years after 1980, when it grew at more than 10% a year, right?
Mhm.
And so
Mhm.
now today, China is an economy 4 times bigger than India's with the same number of
People.
people.
Mhm.
Um, you know, so, what do you want? I don't personally see the logic, the rationale of saying, "Oh no, the manufacturing thing's too difficult or whatever. We won't do that. We'll just go digital services." Um, and of course, India is also is a more unequal society than China as well. So I don't think that the historic model has changed. I think it's been amended, right? And
Mhm.
the way to do it is to make the commitment to smallholder agriculture, make the commitment to manufacturing, and on top of that, take advantage of tradable services that your country can prosper in. And
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
actually it should mean that opportunities for African countries are bigger and better than they've been in other
Mhm.
parts of the world.
Mhm. Mhm. Okay, so let me just go back again to this population density question. So if you look at, say, in Nigeria and Botswana, Nigeria has density, has scale, resources, but has consistently underperformed. Then you look at the Botswana, sparsely populated, but has achieved relative prosperity and institutional competence. How much explanatory work is population density really doing in these two cases? And to what extent does like state capacity or political organization do a better explanatory work than population density?
Well, I think Nigeria versus Botswana, you're not going to get, powerful explanatory force there. I mean, of course, as I said, Botswana is a very weird case study. It's three big diamond mines, a population of only what, 1.5 million people. And they managed those three diamond mines well, which is to say that they negotiated effectively with De Beers and they um, kept going back to De Beers and demanding more from them. Uh, the population density of Botswana, of course, is overall very low, because most of it is Kalahari Desert and all the people are
Mhm.
concentrated in a strip down the east side. Um,
Mhm.
so you're not getting a lot of explanatory power in Botswana from population density, but that my argument is that that's because it's such an outlier. In Nigeria, I would say that you are. Population density is unusually high. It's the highest of any of the of the large population countries. It's about 250 people per square kilometer. And you can say, well, Nigeria has always underperformed. But I would look back over the last 26 years since the start of the century, and since population has doubled again, and say, well, has it? If we look at this country, the first thing I look for, with an increase in population density is the increase in demand for food that comes, because when you get a doubling of population density, you get a tripling of demand for food with even a little bit of economic growth. We've seen that. We've seen agricultural growth um, running at nearly 6% a year since the start of the century in Nigeria. That's not down to good government policy. I mean, government's agricultural policy has been pretty hopeless. That's down
Mhm.
to demand and private sector response, I would say.
Mhm.
Um, and then if you look at somewhere like Lagos and where Lagos has gotten to with, this extreme population density, all of the things that the literature suggests, which is this sort of much improved division of labor, the more affordable infrastructure, creativity, we see all those things
Mhm.
in Greater Lagos, right? Which is now, I think, about a fifth of the entire Nigerian economy. So I would dispute that there isn't evidence that greater population density is not translating into more growth
Mhm.
in Nigeria. And then, of course, if we look at the micro um, level, we've got the rise of some pretty important entrepreneurs and large business groups in Nigeria now. And the most important of all is Mr. Dangote,
Mhm.
who yeah, has just sort of raised the benchmark for the entire continent in terms of what African industrialists can do
Mhm.
with the construction of an oil refinery, a large fertilizer plant. He's now doing another fertilizer plant in Ethiopia and cement plants in, I think, 10, 11, 12 different African countries. So I would challenge the proposition that nothing positive is coming out of Nigeria.
Mm, interesting. If we look at agriculture, one of the challenges we have with, agricultural productivity in Africa, especially in Nigeria, is the, land tenure system and, land reforms. What would an optimal land reform system look like for you? If we were sitting across from the president and we were to define for him what to do to unlock the potential in the agri space, what are some of the things you would put on the table?
Well, I mean, I think around the world we've actually seen high yield smallholder agriculture occur in um, different scenarios of ownership, and we've seen improving yields in a country like China or a country like Ethiopia, where all the land is state owned, but the farmers have the right to use it. And we've seen very good performance in places like Taiwan or in Japan, where it's been clear private ownership. So actually, my own view on this is that the importance of the tenure arrangements tends to get overstated. And we all live in this sort of post Hernando de Soto world where it's supposed to be the most important thing. I personally don't think it is the most important thing. I think that what is the most important thing is the government's ability to deliver extension services and support to make sure that smallholder farmers get fair access to subsidized fertilizer if governments are providing that, which tends not to happen because it tends to go to the big farmers. So in short, what really matters is the extent to which government really does get behind smallholder farmers. And
Hmm.
it needs a shift in attitude, right? I
Hmm.
mean, which is absolutely not there in Nigeria.
Hmm. 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 And again, you make the case quite strongly in your book that agriculture could raise incomes and domestic demand, but in itself, it may not make a country rich, and that's why we need to look at manufacturing. But again, your argument on manufacturing is that supporting the industries is not enough. Government must impose like export discipline, and so on. What does export discipline mean in practice?
Export discipline in practice has always meant that if government is going to provide subsidy in any form, the subsidy could be a direct cash payment. It could be
Hmm.
the government giving something like land for free, could be giving cheap electricity, or most usually providing credit through a directed banking system that is either cheap credit or is available where it wouldn't be available. If the government is going to do that, it's got to see the firms that it supports exporting. Because
Hmm.
in manufactures, if you can export in what is the most competitive globally traded market in the world, the market for goods that are traded internationally is the most competitive market in the world. If a firm can do that, you've got a pretty good indication that they're not just taking whatever subsidies are on offer and pocketing themselves.
Hmm. But your model also assumes a certain level of state capacity, right?
Yeah.
In selecting these sectors,
Yeah.
monitoring the firms, managing the privileges, withdrawing them when they have to. But we know that a country like Nigeria and many other African countries struggles with weak state capacity.
Mm.
So is that not like a secular argument?
I don't think so. I mean, you're completely right that Nigeria has continues to have very serious problems of state capacity. But at the same time, and many of the things it's tried to do over the years to support manufacturing industry have been abysmal failures. But again, if you go back to Dangote, when Dangote was given protection, I think for 4 years for his cement imports, he did what he was supposed to do. And the one time that it worked, Nigeria has got a huge payoff because he's then gone on to do all these other things. So what it requires in a country like Nigeria is not to expect that the whole of government is suddenly going to become more efficient, but to have a defined bit of the bureaucracy that is going to try to um, uh, support manufacturing enterprise and just to sort of silo that
Mhm.
as a particular bit that operates according to its own rules and gets on with that job. And equally, I would say that it's a question, from presidential power looking down in a country like Nigeria, it's a matter of supporting those states that are doing well in in nurturing, private industry and
Mm.
private industry that exports. And that's certainly, a role that a Nigerian president should be able to play more effectively instead of supporting people on the basis that they're from your party or whatever, supporting them on the basis of what they're actually doing for
Mm.
their local populations.
And I'll come to the question on subnationals and so on, but just to stay on the fact that I know I alluded to this at the beginning on corruption and so on. If you have a country where there is this level of corruption, um, are we not running a separate kind of risk by expecting the government to pick and choose winners versus just saying let the create the structure for everyone to go play, compete in the international market, and the ones that are capable would win versus government playing an active role in selecting sectors and selecting firms, knowing that we have this real problem of
Mm.
corruption.
Yeah, but I think that every developing country has serious problems of corruption. And as I say, I think that institutionally, um, it's it's possible to section off bits of the bureaucracy in such a way that the corruption risk is less likely. Um, and I mean, I'd also clarify that no one in industrial policy, no one who succeeds in industrial policy ever picks winners. What you do is you provide a subsidy of one form or another, as I described, to a group of people in a sector that you've identified, and you require them to export. And then some succeed and some fail. And the job of running industrial policy is not about picking winners, it's about culling losers.
Mm,
Um, so when firms are just failing to deliver, it's about cutting them off. Of
mm,
course, it still requires um, a government that's capable of delivering discipline. Um, but I don't know. I think Nigeria is I mean, if we're still talking about Nigeria, I think it's a very complex case, right? Because it has examples, and it's not just Dangote, but you can look in sort of fruit juices and other things. I mean, there are cases of um, of industrial policy that's been highly effective in Nigeria.
mhm,
So it's not a black and white thing. I mean, we can't simply say, all Nigerian government is corrupt and hopeless. It's not, it's self-evidently not the case.
mhm, mhm, mhm. Now, maybe just to see what we can draw from Asia, how did successful Asian countries prevent instances where maybe temporary protection or support becomes like a permanent entitlement? Because again, we've seen where governments may have started out with good ideas that should be temporary and they become permanent. One of them being, fuel subsidies, in Nigeria that then remained for almost 50 years. How did Asian states that provided this temporary protection or support prevent themselves from those things becoming permanent entitlements?
Well, I mean, partly by writing regulations with sunset clauses in them, so that arrangements and subsidies would go. But more generally, as I said, most of the subsidy provided in the Asian states was through the banking system, was through um, uh, relatively,
Development banks?
not necessarily development bank. I mean, through commercial banks as well, and in Japan through private banks,
Mm,
which they did. I mean, they had an interesting system in Japan where they would rediscount loans to exporters. So when Japanese banks lent to exporters, they could take letters of credit for the exporters showing that they were exporting to the central bank and get those rediscounted, which meant that their loan book expanded, so they could grow by virtue of lending to the people the government wanted to lend to. So
mm,
there have been all kinds of clever ways that have been done. And as I say, in most Asian countries, most of the subsidy that was provided through banking systems. There was just an abundance of credit for manufacturers, which encouraged them to grow faster than they would otherwise have grown. And yeah, I mean, that was not something that had a sunset clause or got cut off. And in each of those cases, whether it's Taiwan or Japan or today China, what you see was that the final effect of it was huge trade surpluses from these
mhm,
manufacturing sectors. Um, and the Taiwanese and the Koreans only revalued their currencies and made more of their credit market based in the mid 80s when Reagan came after them. But of course, Trump has tried to do the same thing with China, but it's a different story because the Taiwanese and the Japanese were American allies, whereas the Chinese are an American sort of strategic competitor.
hmm 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 And so when you think about Africa, and I know I don't want to fall into the trap of thinking of Africa like one monolith, but when you think about the continent, can we realistically manufacture competitively, over the next decade? And here I'm struggling with where do we play? What sectors do we play in? You know, how do we play? Do we focus on, say, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area first, or just compete with the rest of the world, exporting into the world markets? How will Africa manage the influx of, say, China, India, Bangladesh, Taiwan, Vietnam, and all these people that are, already supplying into the continent? How do we, what pathway do you see? And I know it's kind of an amorphous question because Africa is not one unit, but
Yeah.
how do you see this playing out?
So it'll be price and profit driven, right? Um, I mean, I suppose the first thing is that, you could go today to Ethiopia and you can see this already happening. So, as one example, in the last couple of years, Ethiopia has totally localized production of ceramics, ceramic tiles for floors, walls, and bathroom stuff. And they've done that by bringing in I think one local and two foreign firms to produce the stuff, and they're doing that because they can happily compete with imports across the African continent. I think that a lot of what is produced, and this you can already see this in the data beginning to that it's beginning to happen. A lot of what is going to be manufactured in Africa is going to be sold in Africa, right? So just the logistics costs and just the capacity to make things to African tastes,
Mm-hmm.
because there will be, I mean, there's a lot of kind of cultural um, nuance in a lot of manufactured product, building materials, going forward. There'll be like African fashions for sort of particular types of building material, and they will, I think, be made in in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a false assumption to think that African manufacturing has to grow up based on competing in Europe or the US or Asia. Some product will go to those places, but I think a lot of what is made is in Africa is going to be sold within the continent. And
Mm-hmm.
of course, the African Union there has the option to look at sort of tariff strategies to encourage that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and in terms of, pricing, um, people are manufacturing in Africa because it's profitable. I mean, the FT's micro database of foreign direct investment last year logged $12.5 billion of Chinese investment in manufacturing in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And that's coming in. When you ask people why are they doing this, they say it's coming in because the margins are better than in China at the moment. China
Mm-hmm.
growth is very slow, and most manufactured markets are oversupplied. So to give you one sort of capital intensive example, in China now, steel trades for about $550 a ton. And in Africa, it trades for anywhere between $800 and $1,200 a ton. So the Chinese who've got enough capacity to make 1 billion tons of steel a year are shipping steel plants to Africa. I'm sure you're aware of the Dinsom one in Zimbabwe that's been quite widely reported. There's one in Algeria. There's one that's just been signed in Western Ethiopia. There's one in South Africa. So, this stuff is is happening, and
Mm-hmm.
it's happening because there's some growth in Africa, right? There's some demand, um, and you can make money manufacturing, and at the
Mm-hmm.
same time, African labor rates. I mean, it is very varied across countries, but African labor rates for manufacturing are cheaper relative to the rest of the world than they've ever been.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And obviously, industrial transformation requires capital, and your third pillar in that sequence is probably the most controversial because what you're advocating is like a deliberate management and sometimes restriction of finance. Um, are you advocating capital controls, managed interest rates, directed lending, state development banks, limits on foreign currency holdings? What are you saying in effect, and how would that work in practice?
I advocate capital controls in any country that has the central bank competence to operate them, which is
Okay.
probably not a large number of African countries, right?
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
again, if you're in Addis Ababa, they know what they're doing, and so they can operate capital controls, just like they did in Botswana, just like they did in Mauritius. You need a small number of competent central bankers, and then you do it, and the advantage is that it allows you, in effect, to trap money in your country, which is what you want to do because you don't want your middle class sending its money off to New York or London in search of better returns. You want that money in the country to finance the development of your country. Um, Beyond that, there's all kinds of possibilities to make a publicly owned banking system or a privately owned banking system serve um, the requirements of industrialization and manufacturing. And if you want to just have a private commercial banking system that is free from government interference, you can do that, and you can um, do what you need to do through a development bank. I would say a development bank is an active development bank is the absolute minimum requirement.
Hmm.
But there's absolutely a case for more than that as well. But again, I think as your question suggests, these things need to be done by by states that are capable of
Exactly.
of managing them. Because I do agree with the proposition that in the end it's better to accept market failure than government failure.
Hmm. Hmm. And even another question is like, if you look at a country where the citizens kind of distrust the currency and are already moving their savings abroad, like you alluded to,
Mm, mm, mm.
would capital controls not make them look for other ways to evade, leaving their monies in the country? And wouldn't that lead to even a worse capital flight?
It may make them look for it, but I mean, when capital controls are rigorously enforced, they are pretty effective. Um, but you're right. I mean, again, if you're going to have capital controls, you want to have them in a country where the population is not already terrified of what the government is up to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um,
Interesting. So if we again look at, say, East Asia, right? Did the East Asian development depend on authoritarianism? And we really need to unpack that. And can African democracies reproduce the economic discipline without reproducing the political repression in those Southeast Asian economies that could have led to the development?
mm, mm, mm. Um, So the question of whether East Asian economies depended on
Yes.
authoritarianism, it's a counterfactual if we try and talk about what it would have been like
Yes.
otherwise, and
Hmm.
we can't answer a counterfactual with much conviction. But I think what we can say is that authoritarianism was an easy option in East Asia because you could as a government, you could get into a situation where you were accepted on the basis of what in Asia came to be known as performance legitimacy.
Hmm.
So um, you deliver 7-8% growth a year, and the population accepts you, even though there's no elections. But that was possible in Korea, in China, in Taiwan, in Vietnam, because each of those countries has a minority ethnic population less than 5%.
Hmm.
So, nobody is put in the position in an autocracy of being like 30% of the population or 40% of the population and permanently locked out of power. So this is a contrast with Africa, right? So if Nigeria or Kenya are autocracies, then 60% or whatever of the population is just permanently locked out.
Hmm.
And that is a much harder political situation to have, and it's much more likely that people will seek violently to overthrow the state of affairs. So that's just, I think, the reality of Africa. It helps to explain why there's relatively more democracy in Africa at an earlier stage of development. And it does make development more difficult because if you're an autocrat, a benign or autocrat, as I think they would style themselves in East Asia, then um, then you can just keep the same policies in place, right? You don't have some other person coming in and challenging you for power every 5 or 6 years
Hmm.
and saying, no, no, I've got a better way of doing it.
Hmm.
So in that sense, yes, it's attractive to be an autocrat. But in Africa, it's not, I think, an option in most countries. I mean, or plenty of people try it, but the countries remain inherently unstable because now you've got a guy who represents, 22% of the population or whatever it is, telling 78% of the population what to do.
Hmm.
It's not going to work. So, as I say in the book, what's notable in the cases of Mauritius and Botswana and Ethiopia, it's a continuing effort in Ethiopia and in Rwanda early on, at least, was this emphasis on having a cross-ethnic coalition.
Hmm.
And I think that this is going to be probably we'll see this as a phenomenon going forward because if you want to have a genuine government of national development, you've got to, hold your hand out to the people on the other side of the political divide, which is not a very normal act in quite a lot of African countries.
Hmm.
So yes, I mean, I hope there will be more of that, and that will allow more consensus to develop about development policy.
Yeah, but I mean, there's this real debate, going on in many corners of the continent, especially if you look at the Afrobarometer data that shows that young people in Africa, do not believe that democracy is the way to go. And if you look at the frequency of electoral competition, uh, juxtaposed against the long-term that's required for industrial policy, to
Mm.
really kick in and deliver the results. Um, are we not going to come up to a point where democracy becomes threatened in Africa as a political arrangement? And if that's the case, what does that, and I mean, this is not going into the political science space, but what does that bode for Africa?
Well, I mean, Patrick, my argument, as I was alluding to there, is that democracy is in most cases the only workable arrangement in Africa, and people need to get their heads around that and get used to it. And so, I think that the cross-ethnic coalitions within the context of democracy are far more viable. I mean, you can say, "Oh, I don't think democracy is the way to go. I want autocracy," but about 10 minutes after that starts, I mean, suddenly, and it's like, it's like ethnically 70 or 80% of your population is now very unhappy.
Yeah.
And there's never going to be stability. So I mean, this we'll just have to see how things pan out going forward. I mean, again, it goes back to demographic density because the reason that all these ethnic groups were able to survive in Africa historically was because they weren't packed in too closely with each other. I mean, it's the
Yeah.
African history is like the opposite of Europe, where Europe became much more densely populated, and then everybody was fighting over land. So, like in the UK, the English just went and kicked the Welsh and the Scots and the Irish to death, and then said, right, everyone's following our rules now. That didn't happen in Africa because with much lower population density, you could groups would sort of dispute, and then you could just go off and find some more land and move somewhere else. But today, with population that has been growing very rapidly since the 1950s, all these people are getting pushed up against each other,
Mm-hmm.
and they need to find ways to get on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's yeah, very interesting. And just to say to our participants, please, if you've got questions, put it in the Q&A tab, not in the comment section, but the Q&A. I'll pick it up from there and I'll give all the right attributions. But Joe, your argument appears to demote, my word, demote good governance from being a starting point of development. What is the minimum governance required for the program you've laid out in the book to work?
I mean, I would say not very much because it's we're talking about catch up here, whether it's in agriculture or in manufacturing or in the financial arrangements. And catch up has been going on for the best part of 200 years already. So if you're kind of serious about these policies, just even on the internet, you can follow the history of all the countries that have successfully developed. You can see what they did. I don't think it's hugely complex. I mean, the reason why I push back a little bit about against governance is that it just kind of assumes that you can get a magic wand and make people govern better.
Mm-hmm.
When you actually look at the reality of what improved governance means, I mean, one thing that's required is increased fiscal revenue, right? So
Mm-hmm.
African governments need to increase their fiscal revenue so they can do more. Yeah, we need African governments to be more capable and do more, but they've got to get their revenues. So it's a kind of chicken and egg problem, and to just sort of say, oh, their governance is no good, to me doesn't really tell us very much. But going forward, I am hopeful, now particularly with the rise of cities, that African governments are going to be better funded because cities, of course, have always been the places that governments get tax.
Mm-hmm.
You
Mm-hmm.
don't really get tax off farmers. You get tax off people in cities.
Mm. And maybe you can help just shed some light on this. There's always this argument about, ensuring that government, first of all, reduces corruption before we can even begin the process of development. Or can productive transformation itself improve governance? Which comes first? Or how do
Yeah.
we even deal with this question?
Yeah, exactly. So I don't subscribe to the idea that you have to get rid of corruption before you can before you can develop. I mean, I think that the progress, economic progress helps you to do that, and it's a much more symbiotic process. Um, but that's not to say that it isn't necessary to have, really strong ongoing anti-corruption actions. And there are lots of things that you can do today that weren't possible in the past, which help. I mean, one is digitization of, which Rwanda, Ethiopia, I don't think is a coincidence that both of them are pushing aggressively on digitization.
Mm-hmm.
And digitization of all kind of local fee and tax payments. And it just takes away sort of opportunities for people who are seeking
mm,
payoffs.
mm. And maybe one more question before I go to
Mm.
our audience. And you alluded to this earlier on, but can Nigeria's transformation begin in or with a small number of competent states rather than from Abuja, or must it be national? I ask this question because there are like macroeconomic stability and progress is controlled from Abuja.
Yeah.
So how do we manage that interaction from the subnational and the national for a subnational that wants to run ahead,
Mm.
and not be hamstrung by Nigeria?
I think it's much more likely that in a federal state like Nigeria, that progress will be led by a small number of states. And you can already see in Nigeria that there's a subset of states where the leadership is more focused, more competent, has a better resonance with foreign investors. And I think that that needs to go on. It's just a difficult thing, isn't it,
Mm-hmm.
in Nigeria as it is in Ethiopia. I mean, the two biggest countries in the continent are both federal states. It's just politically difficult,
Mm-hmm.
um, because the whole federal thing is supposed to be that everybody gets one of everything, everybody's treated the same, but it can't work like that.
Mm-hmm.
What you have to accept is what Deng Xiaoping said at the beginning of China's development when he remarked that some must get rich first,
Mm-hmm.
which was a very, very controversial thing to say in a communist country. But he was right because the competence isn't there in every state and the resources aren't there in every state.
Mm-hmm. So I have a question from Professor Chukwumerije Okereke. He says, this is very insightful. I have not read the book, but I wonder if there's a chapter on the role of international economic structure, interest rate, access to capital, trade barriers, unequal terms of trade in hindering economic growth in Africa. How did the Asian countries handle this?
There isn't a chapter, but there's some material that talks about unequal terms of trade, and the tariffs that are imposed on processed exports as opposed to raw exports. But overall, I'm less pessimistic than many people are about African countries being able to trade with the rest of the world. Um, Obviously some of the Trumpian tariffs have hit African states hard, but I think they're temporary. And with respect to the European Union and the rest of Europe, African countries have tariff-free access for many, many products. And the same now for China as well. The only problem with China being that Chinese aren't buying, but the tariff-free access is there. So the short answer is that no, there isn't a chapter about that subject, but it is dealt with in the book.
Mm, mm. I have a question here from Mukhtar Ishak. I think you've answered the first part of the question, but I'll just ask it for context. He says, you describe the contrast that makes Asian countries more tolerant to the so-called authoritarian governments or repressive political regimes. Do you think constitutional democracy as practiced in Africa is the best governance model for the continent? I think you've answered that part. Or should Africa develop its own governance model that fits its sociocultural economic realities? And I think, maybe that deserves a bit of reflection.
Um, I mean, if you mean at the state level, I think that well, I hope that we'll see going forward new and more ways to manage cross-ethnic political difference. And then at the continent-wide level, I think that the development of the African Union and the free trade area, and then the development of regional trade groups is going to be extremely important. And I don't really have strong conviction as to how I think that's going to go. I mean, there are plenty of reasons to be skeptical because it's, if you think about the AU trying to manage a continent of 55 states is extremely um, difficult. Um, but I do think that the AU is in better shape than it was, 15 or 20 years ago. So the direction of travel is positive.
I have a question from Caleb Obunna. I would like to look at the point of policy consistency, which has been one of the weak points of the democratic dispensation in Nigeria. We often see policy discontinuation, not from the point of monitoring and evaluation, but the overplay of politics. How can this be combated with respect to development? Any thoughts?
Well, it's a really good question. I don't know. I mean, I would personally like to see more effort to develop developmental consensus among um, among the different parties, but that is obviously not the tradition in Nigeria. And I would agree that the changing of direction between regimes is extremely unhelpful for Nigeria's development.
And just a question from me, so in most of the literature we read, we hear things like elite consensus, or even gambling on development, getting the elites to gamble on development. And I've always wanted to ask, how does this work in practice? How do you get people with conflicting political interests at the individual level, to agree to a national development consensus? In places that you've studied, what was the mechanism that got the elite to agree on these things in places where they did?
I mean, I don't have a better answer than that. It's been um, personal relationships between contending political figures. I don't have anything better than that, and but sort of putting national development at the center of the conversation and saying, look, we can do something here um, if we can agree on some sort of parameters of what we support for development, and then say that, yeah, we're gonna put our political weight behind that. But yeah, I don't have a better
Or
answer.
does it only happen when there's a threat of war or threat of just complete anarchy and, disintegration?
Well, I mean, when it happened in Mauritius, there had been after independence some rioting and violence between different ethnic populations there. When it happened in Botswana, there hadn't been any, there hadn't been any, there hadn't been any particular violence or anything like that. But Seretse Khama, who was the head of the most populous ethnic group. I mean, he was the one who had the original diamond mine on his land, and he was the one who said, "Right, we want," as he said, "we're going to make um, mineral resources nationally owned rather than tribally owned." So that was kind of a big, he offered something in that sense.
Mhm.
Um, in Ethiopia with Meles, the whole federal plan there, of course, came off the back of a long civil war against the Derg, and um, and the initial reaction of Kagame in Rwanda, where the majority initially of the cabinet were Hutu recruits, that came off the back of the genocide, of course. So I mean, you can point to, but the reasons are quite different
Yeah.
in those cases. So yeah.
I have two very good questions from Caleb Obunna. And so the first one is, what's the best mechanism to help build the best workforce to execute development policies like Singapore did with its civil service? The second question is on the issue of capital control. He said that he's struggling to see how it can be firmly implemented with the rising technology of cryptocurrency and other mechanisms.
So I'm not sure what the answer is about training training bureaucracies. Um, One observation I would make, though, is that if you get focused, it can be done surprisingly quickly. I mean, Botswana was reckoned by many people to have the least educated population of any British colony. It was a protectorate at independence. There were no schools at all there, I think, until there may have been one missionary school, but there was nothing else until the 1950s. And yet, in the late 1970s, which was 10 years after independence, to Botswana, who'd been sent abroad after independence for further education, they led the negotiations with De Beers, the renegotiation at that stage with De Beers, which got Botswana an even better deal than it had before. And I remember talking in Gaborone with one of the uh, people they work with and just saying how extraordinary it was that after only 10 years of working as civil servants, they were able to do what they did. So I think that, one should be yeah, I mean, optimistic um, if government applies itself, about the amount of time it's going to take. And of course, what if you work in a government um, where you feel that you're really getting something done, if you have a kind of developmental state vibe in government, people then do work incredibly hard
Mm-hmm.
and do get a lot done.
Mm-hmm.
Um, on capital controls, I mean, all I can say is that there are countries in Africa that have capital controls, and those capital controls, to my knowledge, are not being seriously evaded by the latest technologies that are available. Um, I guess because you've got to sort of access funds to transmit through a banking system
Mm-hmm.
anyway.
Mm-hmm. 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 I have a question from Professor Richard Joseph. He says, if tax revenues grow through urbanization, but the percentage diverted through prebendalist practices increases, how do we get the sufficient resources for the state-led development you are advocating? He says we can look at Ghana, for example.
Mm, mm.
Isn't there a trap here that is not being addressed?
Well, it may be a Ghanaian trap. Um, yes, I don't know. It's not something that I have looked at, the extent to which increasing urban tax take is disappearing into the hands of corrupt um, officials. The only thing I'd say is that, again, going back to the point I made about digitization, the opportunities to divert money that is being paid are much less when people are making those payments digitally, and um, the better off people are, the more likely they are to be able to use digital payment
Mm,
mechanisms, and the more they'll be paying, and the more you're going to protect. I mean, certainly it was only like I think 2 weeks ago that the so-called MESOB digital system, the new digital system in Ethiopia, went live on everybody's phones, such that they can now pay. You can pay across 200 different services off
mhm,
your phone, and in Ethiopia they've got not only M-Pesa, which has come in with Safaricom getting the second phone license, but the Ethio Telecom has developed its own version of M-Pesa called Telebir. So you can, do cashless transactions for all your tax liabilities.
mhm, mhm. Interesting. There's an interesting question here from Felix Niwagaba. He sets a context that is not quite what your book is arguing, but I'll present it. He says, "Thank you so much for the presentation. I'd like more clarity on why agriculture alone cannot develop a country." I'm not sure that's what the book is saying. Africa has two seasons and fertile soils, and but they import food products. This looks like a leverage when managed well. I thought if Africa would trade minerals for agriculture modernization and standardization, it can easily develop from the sector. So, I mean, I think it's an opportunity to maybe just talk a bit more on, the role agriculture plays in this development path. And I know you already shared that, and then argue for how that then moves to manufacturing and the financial discussion in the book.
Yeah, I mean, I said before that smallholder farming plays an important role in delivering broadly based increasing incomes, and it plays an important role in delivering very broadly based consumption, which requires goods and services that can be manufactured and produced locally. So all that's important. The To some extent, the peculiarity of smallholder agriculture in Africa is that with the very rapid rate of urbanization that we're seeing in Africa, which is faster than we've seen elsewhere in the world, um, it's having a knock-on effect on peri-urban agriculture, where we are seeing yields rising in some cases close to or at and above Asian levels. Now, this is just in peri-urban parts of Africa around cities, but the cities provide such constant, reliable demand for agricultural producers that they invest in small pumps, they irrigate their crops, and they will put 2, 3, 400 kilos of fertilizer per hectare on their land, which is sort of Asian levels of fertilizer use because they know that they'll get the money back, because they know that with irrigation, there won't be a problem of the rain not coming when it's supposed to come. So around cities now, we're starting to see a new type of prosperous farmer. The problem is that because of the very low levels of support most African governments give to smallholders, these people tend to be urban dwellers who go and lease land or buy land around cities and then have people working for them farming. But nonetheless, peri-urban farming can happily generate 5 to 10,000 US dollars per hectare in sub-Saharan Africa now, compared with an average of about $500 for rain-fed, more rural agriculture. So all of that is very positive and very very important.
I have a question on natural resources or resource-rich countries, states.
Mm.
Um, can they build the discipline that your model requires, or do the rents inevitably weaken their ability to do otherwise?
Just say again, Patrick.
So can oil or mineral rich states build the discipline that your model requires?
Yeah.
Or do the rents they extract from the state make that impossible?
Well, I mean, certainly the historical record around the world is not good, and it's particularly bad in Africa, and it's worse for hydrocarbon states than for mineral states. But I mean, in the end, it comes down to human agency, how these resources are treated, right? So you can't make hard and fast rules. I mean, the um, the 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 Botswanan government was really very honest, and it got, even though in the 80s it was accounting for a quarter by value of global diamond output. The money was recycled into roads, schools, hospitals. I mean, they followed a very orthodox prescription. But they also showed that in Africa, there's no reason why people can't treat mineral and hydrocarbon resources that way. In contrast, you've got a country like Angola, where it has been historically just financially raped by the people who are supposed to be running the country. Um, but I don't think there's any inevitability about it. I mean, if you look at the Middle East, I'm not a great fan of Gulf despots. But if you look at United Arab Emirates or you look at Qatar, these sorts of places, um, you know, they have not looted to the point that it's undermined the development of their nations. So I don't think there's any inevitability, but there are real problems with particularly hydrocarbons. The money comes, the money comes flooding in, the currency appreciates, the so-called Dutch disease effect. All other exports are then kind of priced out of world markets,
Mhm.
and the politicians tend to use the revenues um, for short-term bribes, if you like, for the population. So they do very short-term things that, in the context of if it's a democratic polity that they think will help them to get
Mhm.
invested.
Re-elected.
So, but I think the final point on that, Patrick, is that when people ask me now what I think about outcomes in Africa, my answer is that I expect the biggest range of outcomes that the world has seen on any continent. So in East Asia, we have from Myanmar to Japan in terms of GDP per capita outcomes. Myanmar, incidentally, being a country that was tipped after the Second World War by the World Bank as a as a as a great potential development hotspot.
Mhm.
And so East Asia holds the record for the biggest range of developmental outcomes, but I'm pretty confident Africa is going um, to take over that.
What
That,
drives that
that
confidence?
what drives the confidence? My
Yeah,
confidence in why?
yeah.
Just because there's 55 countries, just because there's so many countries, there's so much diversity. Um, but I'm a big part of it is that I'm confident on the upside that there's going to be a number of countries that are going to really positively surprise the world.
Mm, mm. I have a question from Willie Brent. He's like manufacturing, which is the number two on the sequence, seems much harder to imagine for Africa with the rise of automation, robotics, and AI. Manufacturing seems like a big question mark in the thesis. What's your view on that, given everything that's happening or that's coming?
Well, so this is the kind of objection du jour or something, whatever we're going to call it. I mean, yeah, there's a big sort of thing been going on in academia and development circles saying that, oh, robotics and AI, digitization are going to change the nature of manufacturing, and it won't happen in Africa. And I fail to understand this proposition. I mean, technical change in manufacturing is ongoing, and it always has been ongoing. Um, but this debate never involves a discussion of cost.
Hmm.
So, I mean, a robot, even a basic robot in a garmenting factory costs $100,000, and then they go up into the sort of millions of dollars.
Hmm.
So we're comparing that in Africa, which is going to be a sunk upfront cost. We're comparing that with paying between $60 and $120 a month for African factory labor, which is what you would have paid in China in the mid 1990s. So I'm wondering why an entrepreneur who can use a more labor intensive production line is going to do that, given that you can hire labor and you can fire labor as you
Hmm.
require. And if you go, for instance, to Ethiopian industrial zones where people are investing, day and night at the moment, you'll see exactly this. It's not that they're investing with tons and tons of robots. They're doing much more sort of traditional production lines. In China, people are using a lot of robots, but in China, labor now costs $700 a month in a factory. So
Hmm.
it's a very different calculation. Um, and similarly with all the propositions about what AI is going to do, I think AI is going to affect services much more than manufacturing, at least over the next five to 10 years. So
Hmm.
I don't buy it. Maybe I'll be proven wrong. But as I say, if you go into any industrial zone in Ethiopia today and you tell them that manufacturing isn't going to happen in Africa, they will think you're a lunatic.
Hmm. I have a question here from Oluwafemi Folarin. Um, he says, I've not read your book, so I would want to know the role of elite consensus in the development of Asian countries and the lessons for African elite.
Well, if in a developmental state, if that's what we're talking about, there's always a high degree of elite consensus. As I said before, I don't think the elite consensus is hard to arrive at because what you're essentially doing is what people have been doing for the last 200 years who want to develop their economies as quickly as possible. And whether you go back and read about um, late 19th century Germany, or you read about Taiwan in the 1950s, you're getting for me similar messages. So there's elite consensus around that. It comes from just like having a basic knowledge of how countries have gotten rich historically.
Hmm.
Um, and in Africa, if you want to have elite consensus, you need to have people having a sort of a basic understanding of the history of development. And you find that in countries that have developed rapidly, they do.
Hmm.
If you go to Mauritius and talk to people who were involved in the development program there, they know the history of other countries and development. Um,
Hmm.
same in same in Ethiopia, same in Rwanda. So I don't, not sure what I can offer more than that.
Hmm. 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 Okay, so let's say by 2030, which three indicators would convince you that Nigeria, for instance, has genuinely begun a development takeoff, rather than merely entered another period of cyclical growth? What three things would you be looking out for?
Um, so the first one is just to see the growth rate push up a bit
Okay.
further, which I think should be absolutely possible. And I mention that because and to push up further and remain at a similar level year after year. Okay. And this is very important. It's a point that's usually missed in discussions around development because the reason is that you've got to get the private sector investing, right? And the way that you get the private sector investing is to deliver um, a pretty steady growth
Hmm.
rate. The
Hmm.
Chinese used to sort of say that they used to have an expression meaning ensure eight.
Hmm.
All the people in government would talk about ensuring eight because they just had to deliver 8% each year. So I think that if Nigeria gets its growth rate up a little bit further and keeps it there consistently, what we'll start to see is the investment rate, the private investment rate,
Hmm.
kicking up, getting up above that sort of 25% of GDP, or the total investment rate getting up above that 25% of GDP, which tends to sort of mark the trigger point. It
Hmm.
did in East Asia back in the 70s. It did in India from the early 1990s. And then because basically you've then got the private sector is risking its money and it becomes an additional engine of growth. And it's not just about, what the public resources are.
Hmm.
Um, so those would be two indicators that I would look for, and yeah, and then I'd like to see an indication of manufacturing growth, getting up into double digits, more than 10% manufacturing growth per
Hmm.
year.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, I think that manufacturing growth in Nigeria may turn out to be of a quite sort of particular nature in that, of course, if you think of what Dangote's done, it's all quite upstream. So then we might be waiting for a lot more stuff downstream of that to come into play. Um, but those things, I don't think that Nigeria is going to turn into a developmental state, right? I don't imagine that that's the case. But I do think that Nigeria can consistently move at sort of 5.5%, 6% a year, can mobilize private sector investment, and I think that that will be, a pretty sort of happy place that
Hmm.
will involve, quite a large number of states not quite getting their act together, but a subset of states, moving fast.
Hmm. Hmm. Interesting. And if you imagine that an African president, finance minister, governor, senior advisor, whatever, is listening in right now, what's the single most important decision that leader can take tomorrow morning, to move from just rhetorics about transformation to actual work of development?
I mean, I think you just get focused on what's important. You get focused on smallholder agriculture, on manufacturing, and you figure what you need to do with your financial system to support those those ends. But each country will be different because levels of state capability vary so much.
Hmm.
The only caveat to that is I would say we don't really know what African state capability is yet until governments have a bit more money to be
Hmm.
able to do to be able to do some more stuff.
Hmm. Hmm. And Joe, maybe just last word to you. We've come up to the end of this session. Maybe something you want to talk about that we didn't get to in my questioning? Mhm.
Um, no, I don't think there is anything. I think I've enjoyed it. The questions were great, and thank you so much for inviting me. And I hope that we can do this again in 10 years' time, and I will turn out to have been more right than the skeptics.
Exactly, exactly. And so thank you so much for joining us on Development Discourse. The book is How Africa Works: Success and Failure on the World's Last Development Frontier. Thank you so much, Joe, for joining us. Thank you, everyone. And I'm Patrick Okibo, and this has been Development Discourse. Have a fantastic day. Bye for now.